T. Menezes Souza. T. Menezes Souza. I would have not known Professor Mario if it had not been for a Brazilian project studying the literature of Goa, a Brazilian project called Pensando Goa, Thinking Goa. So I'm grateful to them for bringing us in touch. And we've met, we've encountered each other, and at both offline, online, and all these kind of things. Today I've dragged Professor Mario on screen to tell us two things, primarily about his migratory experience and about his work. He's a full professor at the University of Sao Paulo in Brazil. Sao Paulo is to Brazil what Bombay is to India, right, Doctor?
Yeah.
Somewhat. So tell us about your own trajectory, because you are Aden born, you're a British citizen, you're a permanent resident in Brazil, of course Goan origin and OCI. So like this is typically Goan. Like, tell us about it.
Okay. First, thank you for inviting me for this interview. My migratory experience comes from my mother's side of the family mainly. They are from Bardes. My grandparents built a house in Ukasaim, but I think they're from, I don't remember exactly where, from the Seoline side. And from my great-grandfather is from Asagao. So that part of the family migrated to Aden in 1829.
Wow, that's very early, yeah.
Very early, yes. It's about the time just after the British occupied Aden and made it into a protectorate. Right? And they went back and forth between Aden and Goa. Obviously, they did the thing at the time where they married in Goa and took their wives to Aden. Right? And going and coming and always spending holidays in Goa until this went on until my father, my parents had an arranged marriage in Goa, and my father, who graduated from the GMC as a doctor, was brought to Aden to marry my mother. Right? So on my mother's side, they were all born in Aden or in Karachi. They were located in Karachi and Aden, but all spent holidays in Goa. And my father's side, my father was the first in his family to migrate. And then we were sent to, as you may know, that in the 60s, Aden was in the middle of an anti-colonial war against the British. So my parents sent us, me and my brothers, as children, to boarding school in England, where I spent all my school life in England until I graduated from university there. And my parents continued in Aden even after independence. And then when Mozambique was becoming independent, my father had contacts with the people who were in Frelimo at the time, before independence, who were in the medical area, and doctors like him. And so they invited him to help set up the health system in newly independent Mozambique.
After independence, that's unusual, no?
Yeah. So he went. My parents went from Aden to Mozambique in 1970, the beginning of 1975. I joined them at the end of that year because I graduated, and I just went to visit them. And unexpectedly, I was offered a job at the university.
Edward Mondlane University.
Yeah, that's right. And so that's why I began my university career unexpectedly.
Life happens when you're making other plans. But did you know Aquino Briganza and things like that from this period there?
Yes, he was a friend of my father's. Yes, I met him, and I think his nephew, if I'm not mistaken, was my student as well. It was Maputo or Lorenzo Marx at the time was a small place, so people met each other.
And then you moved to Brazil. This was in
Then in 1979, things began to get difficult in Mozambique. The civil war was beginning, and I was also I was interested in doing postgraduate studies, and I didn't want to go back to Europe. I never liked to live in Europe. So I had friends in Sao Paulo who invited me to. They offered me a job in Sao Paulo, so I
wow.
came to Sao Paulo,
I
and
see.
here I did all my postgraduate studies in Sao Paulo.
And doctor, currently you're teaching in the Department of English, or what's it called?
Yeah, it's not. It's called the Department of Modern Languages. So it's English, English, French, Italian, Spanish, and German.
I see. I see.
I work with literature and with linguistics, which is very unusual in the area because some people prefer to specialize in language or linguistics. I work with both.
And
Um,
semiotics is one of the fields which, the more you try to explain, the more complex it seems to get, at least to me. So how would you explain it in simple language?
Semiotics is exactly what's on the borderline between language and literature, or language and art, let's say, right? Because it studies how meaning is constructed, and not just in verbal language. When we talk about language, normally we mean verbal language, but in language as a system of meaning. So, like the visual language of art, the fictional language of literature, body language, any kind of language. And nowadays, what we study a lot is in the language of the internet. So any kind of system of conveying and constructing meaning is the object of study of semiotics.
So in that sense, how did you pick up Portuguese? Because being in Aden, I presume, like, you must have been Anglophone Goan in that sense. And where
Yeah,
did Portuguese come on?
my father's side.
So do you
My
consider yourself truly bilingual today, or I mean, you
yeah,
can,
my father always spoke. My When my father went to Aden, I mean, at the time that he graduated from the GMC, it was all Portuguese, right?
yeah,
So
that was
when
his first
he
language. Yeah.
yeah, so when he and he spoke Konkani fluently as well, right? The So when he came to Aden, he didn't actually his knowledge of English was just reading knowledge, right? So he had to pick up English and Arabic when he came to Aden. My mother didn't speak Portuguese. She picked up Portuguese with my father, right?
Wow.
So even though she spent holidays in Goa um, every year, they didn't really. They understood Portuguese, but they didn't really speak Portuguese.
Dr. Aden was a small but I mean thriving Goan center of migration.
Yeah,
People like Keith Vaz and all have a Aden link. One of my
yeah.
friends,
He
Eric
was my
Pinto. Yeah.
yeah. We went to school together.
Eric Pinto was is another Goan who came back to Goa, one of our friends, and he married a lady, one of our classmates also, whom only after they married they discovered that both of them were in Aden and both of their families were friends.
Oh,
So
really?
yeah, it's quite
Yeah.
unusual. But tell us something. I know.
The
Sorry.
Goan doctors in Aden were my father's family because my father was the eldest. So when he went to Aden as a doctor, then he brought his cousins along who were also doctors because my father was brought up by his uncle because he was orphaned at a young age. So he was brought up by his uncle who was a doctor in Mapsa and whose children were also doctors. So they all we had at one stage four Dr. De Souzas in Aden. Yeah.
The link between Goans and tropical medicine somehow is waiting to be studied in that sense all over
Yeah,
in those
that's
in
right.
those years. But doctor, tell us, how do you look at Goan literature from Brazil? I know that the Brazilians are quite interested in aspects of Goan literature. In fact, I always say that if we want to understand Goan writing in Portuguese, for example, you all know it better than we do today.
Yeah, that's because of the language, but and it's the efforts of Elder Garmes, you know, who
Individuals like
coordinates.
Helder Garmes, who
Yeah,
is a professor at USP and
yeah.
heads the project
So
here.
I first met Elder when I was on his his qualifying committee for his doctorate.
I see. So you're senior
So
to him. You're senior to him.
yeah,
I see.
so I was a colleague and a friend of his supervisor, his PhD supervisor, who was a specialist in African literature in Portuguese, right? Which is also something that I worked with, right? So there was, when Helder was studying Goa, there was no one to be on his PhD committee, so I was dragged along. So that's how I met Helder. And it was actually my first contact with writing in Goa in the 19th century, right, through Helder, because my other, the Goan literature that I was familiar with was through Peter Nazareth, right?
The English
Um,
side, yeah, the English
the
and
English side.
translation.
Peter Nazareth, who I corresponded with in the 90s, and he sent me a lot of stuff on Goan literature, which I was interested in at the time.
Peter's
So
an
I had
amazing an amazing networker. Unfortunately, he's not into the online world so much, but he's been networking from then.
that's
Sorry,
right. In fact, in 2019, when I was last in Goa, I met his brother,
John Nazareth.
yeah, who's also interested in Goan literature, right? He doesn't write about it, but he was very much. We had a long conversation on Goan literature.
True, true.
Now, what the way I look at it, my elder and most of the other people in the project are from literature and from Portuguese literature, right? Now, one of Elder's, let's say, right-hand men, who's Cielo Festino,
Yep.
who you know,
Yeah.
Cielo Festino,
Right hand ladies.
that's right. Cielo did her PhD with me. I supervised her PhD, and she did it on Indian literature and English, right? So when Elder was trying to set up this project, now I suggested that Cielo should work with him closely. Cielo didn't know anything about Goan literature.
Okay.
We were good friends. We still are. So she knew about Goa, but not Goan literature. So now Cielo works practically, does all her research in the past few years on Goan literature. Now, my take on Goan literature is a little bit different because, as you know, this project is a big project and there are people from Portugal as well involved. And they look at Goan literature from the perspective of Portuguese literature, right? Now, as I'm not a student of Portuguese literature. My reading of Goan literature is different. They look at it from a historical perspective. I look at it from a semiotic perspective, from the perspective always of the present. Right? So for me, it's not so important to fit Goan literature in Portuguese, pre 1961 into. I'm not concerned with fitting it and reading it in terms of the Portuguese literary tradition. I'm more concerned with what we as Goans can learn from this now.
What would
So
that be? What would
yeah,
that be?
I don't see history. I don't see history as something of the past. I see history always as something which we can learn from the present. Right? So there is one way of looking at literature is to trying, and we do this especially in my university, in the literary the tradition of literary analysis at the University of São Paulo was very much influenced by a Brazilian intellectual called Antonio Cândido. Right? And this must be also the background of Elder and lots of the people in the project. And he was a Marxist literary critic, and he always said that we have to read texts in relation to their context of production, right? And so the important thing when you're reading a literary text is to study its context, the context in which it was produced.
Like
The text,
one example. Could you give us?
for any literary text, any writer of any literary text was influenced by his own historical, social, political context, right? So if we're looking at Goan literature in the 19th century, right, who were these writers reading, right? What kind of social context were they inserted in? What were their concerns? What were the problems of this context? What were the political issues of this context? If we understand all of these things, then we can understand, so the theory goes, then we can understand the text that they produced better, right? So that's one way of looking at it. So you look at a text in relation to its context of production. Now, for me, as a semiotician, there is always an interpreter. There's no context without interpreters. So the important thing when you're looking at a text in terms of its context of production, you who are looking at that text are also inserted into a context of production, right? So for me now, as a Goan reading 19th century texts written by Goans, I cannot ignore the fact that I'm a Goan of the 21st century reading these texts, right? I cannot pretend I'm reading them as someone who was contemporary with them in the 19th century. That's one way of doing it, right? To see how they are connected to their context. What are the issues of their context and how these are expressed in their texts. But I'm more interested in looking at it as looking at literature as an encounter between the context of the writer and the context of the reader.
That's very
And
interesting, Doctor. What you say is very interesting. But if I could pick your brains a bit more,
sure,
the reality is always very confusing and complex. Like, how would we, for example, say interpret someone like Orlando Costa, no, the father of the current Portuguese Prime Minister Antonio Costa, okay, who comes from a privileged background in that sense, a big wealthy upper caste Brahmin Margao family from Rua,
right.
Bedaparia and things like that, but nonetheless has a very strong empathy for the underclass, for the downtrodden. And his story is set in Osinio Dira is set among the Kunbi families and
Yeah.
Gauda families of that. How would you make sense of this to someone like me, like for example?
Okay, so I'd read that as portraying, for example, social injustice, right? Inequality, and all of this appearing within a colonial context. But for us today, we read it as how do those injustices and inequalities play out today? They haven't ended with the end of colonization,
Hmm.
right? They have transformed. Those inequalities and injustices have been transformed into other inequalities and injustices, right? So, for example, in Signo de Ira, it's very much dichotomic, right? You have the haves and the have-nots, right? Now, if you read it from a perspective of present day Goa, with all of the migration of uh, Indians who were not born in Goa into Goa, it doesn't become so dichotomic. It becomes much more complex,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
And Goa becoming at the moment being the playground for the rest of India. So we don't have the dichotomies of the property owners and the workers. These things
Right.
become much more complex, and the injustices take other configurations. Right?
Right. Professor, people like Dr. Helle Garmes, of course, I should be asking this to him, but have also spawned a lot of young students who have been studying certain aspects of
Yep.
Goan literature, comparing Goan writing in Portuguese to Brazilian writing of the same period. Comparing one novel here with a novel in Brazil. Any
Yeah.
comments on that?
No, I think that's the purpose of literature. I'm not going into purpose or intention as being something conscious, but I think literature is that bridge, right? It opens up the space for cultural exchanges and especially for what I call intercultural contact, which is understanding the world through the eyes of others, where we begin to see that this alterity or difference is not something which is out there, it's within us as well. So by understanding difference as it plays out externally, we can understand the complexity within us. right?
And would you argue that countries like Brazil have a role to play in this? Because Portugal, I mean, for whatever its changes, we still have the hang up that they are our colonizers, and we 60 years later we have a problem in accepting some of them, or some of us have a problem in accepting them, whatever it is. So as one participant in Pensando put it, he or she said, I don't recall, she said, because you all Brazilians are doing it, you can do it. If we were doing it, we would have never got this far in even building these academic bridges. So do you think Brazil can play a role here because of the
I think
political?
there are lots of similarities. For example, just looking at social injustice and inequality, uh, in Goa, it plays out in terms of the complexities of religion and caste, right? Um, the In Brazil, it plays out in terms of race, right? So there is this official uh, idea that Brazil is where race becomes dissolved. Brazil is a racial democracy. It's not true. Brazil is very racist, and Brazil, similar to the U.S. but in a different way, uh, is also a culture which is permeated by structural racism. Right. So Brazil has never dealt with its past of slavery, for example, sufficiently well. So slavery was abolished in Brazil for reasons other than to put an end to the unequal treatment of human beings. Slavery was abolished for in terms of capitalism and profit rather than the humanitarian aspect of it. Right.
Just like how
So those,
colonialism came to an end for reasons other than other than wanting to
yeah,
end colonialism, but in Brazil.
exactly. I mean, so Brazil is unusual in Latin America because it immediately went from a colony to an empire. Right. The son of the king of Portugal was crowned emperor. So, I mean, what kind of independence was this? It was very clear that the independence of Brazil was in the hands of the landowners, right?
All our history is very complex, to be fair. Even
Yeah,
Indian Goan history and everything, it's extremely
that's
complex.
right. So, if you see the role that landowners played in Brazilian history, and they still do until today, right? Uh, this is not dissimilar to the way that the landowners are portrayed in Signo da Ira, for example. Right?
That's very interesting. What next from here? What next? Is your interest in Goan literature vetted by Pensando? Do you plan to look at more? Before that, tell us about the this. Is it a short story? It's an essay that you wrote, which is very
Yeah, it was.
fascinating.
I wrote it as part of Pensando Go, and because I wanted to bring to Pensando Go the experience of diaspora, right? Because for me at that time, there was very much the influence of Portuguese literature, the Portuguese perspective of Goan literature, right? So after that, English became Cielo is very much, she's written about English, and Paul Castro writes about the English production of English literature. But I wanted to bring in the diaspora experience as well as being Goan, right? And I feel this the many times I've been to Goa. There is a certain, let's say, I'd even call it nationalist reaction against people from the diaspora like me, right? Um, uh, that idea probably it has its origin in the resentment that you people left and we stayed. We we faced the music and you people left,
A
right?
bit of envy, a bit of envy, a bit of feeling that y'all guys are know-it-alls or whatever. I mean, yeah, it's
Yeah,
there.
but I mean, we didn't get a good deal. I know from my father's family experience. I mean, in '61 and after, they lost all their land as well, right?
True.
So it wasn't just a happy experience of being abroad. And what motivated me to write that is the idea of a Goan identity. I mean, there's that novel Goan Identity by Carmo de Souza, right?
Yes.
Um, and Goan identity for me was always problematic. It was always there, but we could never put a finger on it or say
Yeah.
what it was. Hmm? So we always knew in the diaspora, and when I say we, I mean my father's and mother's siblings are spread all over the world in Australia, Canada, uh, Britain, um, in Belgium, all over Portugal. But when we get together, in spite of the language differences, we feel Goan, right? And it's generally connected to food. So wherever you are, whatever language you speak, you still like your Shakoti and your Sorpatel
Food
and
and
your
music,
Goan
food and music and football,
groceries.
food, music, football,
Pardon?
no? Food, music, football.
Music, not so much. Music, yes, when with the not in my generation, in our older generation, we had that tradition. Every time the family got together, there would be a sing song, right? So we can recognize all the classical Goan songs in Konkani, right? But we don't actually sing them, right? But yes, they when we heard our parents singing, even though we criticized it, we it made us feel at home. And this happened wherever you went. It could happen in Sydney, it could happen in Toronto, it could happen in London or Lisbon, right? But you had these same rituals all the time, and it's not so much connected to territory, right? It's not external territory, it's connected to territory which is within us, right?
It's a
So it's
territory of the mind, or something
territory
like
of the
that, right?
mind, certainly. Yeah.
In Goa's case, because it's so scattered
Yeah.
and so spread out, and we are
Yeah.
so tiny. And so your essay is called "The Goan Patient or Impatient Goan: A Cultural Speculation." It's not an essay. It's not a short story. What would you call it? And how would you
I
explain it?
was inspired by the Indian critic Gayatri Spivak. She calls it a cultural speculation, right? So, which doesn't really mean anything. It could mean absolutely anything, actually. Uh, so, cultural speculation, just a reflection on culture. Now, I wrote it based on an actual experience. In 2007, I had brain surgery, and I had a tumor removed from the brain.
Wow.
And just in the same week after the surgery, I had a, what do you call it in English, a bleeding in the brain. I forget what the term
Uh,
is. A stroke. A stroke. I had a stroke. So I, for some time, I kind of lost my memory, right? And for some time, I couldn't choose the language that I was speaking. So suddenly, I was speaking Arabic
oh
when I,
God, my goodness, that's scary, yeah.
and I hadn't spoken Arabic since my childhood, and I couldn't control what language, English, Portuguese, or Arabic. Uh, I could never speak Konkani, though I could understand it. The Konkani didn't come into it. So I went through this experience of. I was very much conscious that people couldn't understand, and then I realized they were hearing a language that I couldn't hear because I thought I was speaking in Portuguese when actually what was coming out was Arabic, or I thought I was speaking in English and what was coming out was Portuguese. And it gave me the experience of this distancing from myself, right? So the person who other people were interacting with was not that person that I felt I was, right? And this idea of displacement suddenly made me think this is what being Goan in the diaspora has always been, right? People look at you like when I grew up in England, we were called Indian, right? I had never had the experience of being Indian, right?
We
When
see
I grew up,
ourselves through the mirror that other people place in front of
yeah.
us. So
So I grew up knowing that I was Goan. My father was part of the anti-Indian movement. He, he he wanted Goa for Goans and not Goa to be part of India or to be part of Portugal, right? So he was always. So we grew up in this. No, Goa is Goa. Goa is not India, right? And when I went to England, we were called Indian, and I was always as a child, as in this displacement. Just a minute, I'm not Indian, I'm Goan. And then the but in England they weren't familiar with what Goa was. For them, it was all India,
it's
and we
all the
were all
same, yeah.
black.
Yeah.
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 And same in Brazil. People, Goans are Indians. They don't know what Goa is, right? So this idea of displacement was very much, I was very much aware of it after my stroke. And I had to have treatment to recuperate my memory, neurological treatment, right? So that experience, which is situated as the Goan patient. And then it was irritating for me because when the neurologist wanted me to recuperate my distant memories, because I had a recent memory, but I'd lost my distant memory. And he kept looking at me, as a Brazilian neurologist would, as an Indian, right? And so he was asking me questions always about his Brazilian stereotypical idea of India, right?
I see.
Trying to poke my memory. He had absolutely no idea that I wasn't born in India. I was born in Aden. He had no idea of the complexity of what it means to be Goan. And I had difficulty in speaking, but I was very much irritated by the questions, and that was my impatience. Listen, doctor, I'm not the person you think I am. That kind of thing. And that's what provoked me to think, that's always my experience of being Goan with other people outside Goa. I'm not what you think I am. And so they could ask the question, so what do you think you are? And so we'd say, oh, well, I'm Goan. And then you go to Goa and you realize that what you consider to be Goan is not what Goans in Goa consider to be Goan. Right?
Yeah. I know exactly what you're saying, because this is a typical migratory experience. And
Yeah.
when we came back in the 60s, we faced much of the same. You've gone there with an idea which is frozen in time, and it changes quite frequently here.
That's
and all
right.
those kind of things.
Yeah.
But that's fascinating. So just would you like to read a small bit of this passage from your
Sure.
essay?
So this bit, let me see, where is it? So it begins here. The well-dressed elderly lady accompanying, was it guarding the patient, was quick to interrupt. Doctor, my husband isn't Brazilian. He's a Goan. If you don't mind, they don't like to be called Indian. Sorry, Signora, said the doctor. I wasn't aware there was a country called Goa. There isn't. It's India, she answered, trying to hide her now increasing impatience. She was at that stage where the suspicion of the dementia of her husband had irritated her to the extent that she became acutely aware of symptoms of possible dementia in all those that crossed her path. Dr. Roberto turned to the gray-haired elderly gentleman, looking distractedly at the medical volumes in the glass-fronted bookcase beside him. On meeting a new patient, he had the habit of looking out for an adjective that immediately came to his mind and using it as a coordinate for the stance he would adopt in his chosen line of treatment. The word that came to him as he crossed gazes with the patient was surprisingly wise. A patient with suspected dementia, and the word was wise. Containing his own surprise, he continued, Ah, Signora, so he doesn't like to be called Indian because he's now Brazilian? No, Doctor, he's in fact British. Ah, born in London by any chance, said the doctor to the gentleman, trying to be pleasant and catch his attention. I did my PhD at King's in London. He tried to stake out the common ground between them as academics. The man turned from the bookcase and gave a tired, almost blasé smile at the doctor. Doctor, my wife simplifies things. I'm Goan, but I'm also British, Yemeni, and Portuguese. I could be Indian, but India requires me to abandon my other nationalities to be an Indian citizen. And if I do that, I will no longer be Goan. After 40 years here, I could also be Brazilian. But why have a fourth passport that doesn't tell me who I am? Not
And it
stop
goes
work.
on, but it's very intriguing and interesting, and I really enjoyed going through it. On this note, Doctor, really, unless you need to mention anything else, but I appreciate the time you spent and also the download of all this, of all these experiences and rich with knowledge that helps us to understand ourselves at a new level. Uh, would you have I not asked you anything, or would you like to add?
No, I'd
Or
just like to say that I use the word, I use the metaphor of dementia in this text. So here we have a patient who, because he has lost his memory, the neurological definition of people who have lost their memory is dementia, right? Because if you lose your memory, you lose your identity. And so and they call it dementia. So I actually went through treatment for dementia. Uh, the and when you as a Goan, where you see, for us in the diaspora, where we are, our concept of identity is connected to memory, but to very complex other kinds of memory. So for someone who was born and continues to live in the place of his birth, his or her birth, trying to understand this complexity really must sound like dementia, right? So, I'm for me, it's always been connected. Being Goan or talking about Goanness in the experience of diaspora to someone else always sounds a bit demented.
no, no, but I mean, to us, it doesn't, because there are a lot of us who, Bades is full of these stories, particularly other parts of the
Yeah,
state also. But where, someone has gone out, they've come back, and they are part of the diaspora now, and then they're part of the Goan community. And, people like me who spent 50 years in Goa after, coming in from Brazil and things like that. So it's a very mixed experience, and I can understand what you're saying. Very, very sage words and very interesting thoughts, not only from the point of view of health and identity formation, but also from the point of view of understanding our own literature and how we produce it or how we go about it. Thanks so much for your time. One last
I'd
thing,
just
your
like to
contact.
say one last thing,
No,
Frederick,
but
if I
before
may.
that, your contact, doctor, your contact. Then while I put it in here, you can say your last thing.
Okay,
Email or whatever,
yeah.
or
So
whatever
it's
you prefer. Whatever you prefer.
my email,
Yeah,
linmario together at gmail.com.
fine. So sorry, I interrupted you.
I'd just like to say that remembering uh, my friend Alito Siqueira and his students, and especially I identified very much with the work which that volume here he was beginning to organize when I met him in 2012, Hong Kong, right?
That's being
The
published this Sunday. Please come if you can make it.
Yes,
Yeah,
I'll be there. I'll be there.
and say a
But
few words also.
the group, his group of students, they bring up exactly a complexity of Goan identity, which doesn't reach the pages of Goan literature, right? So the experience of shame, the experience of caste discrimination, these things are looked at always from top down in Goan literature, whereas the
True.
contributions of his group, they're looking at them from bottom up, which I think is a very refreshing contribution to Goan thinking.
But to end on a slightly offbeat note, don't forget Alito is ex-Afrikaner also, ex-Kenya, if I'm not mistaken. Thank you so
Yeah,
much, Doctor, for your time. Real pleasure. Real pleasure. Bye.
it's a pleasure for me.
Bye.